Good afternoon. This is a Devar Torah on Megillahs Ruth. Megillahs Ruth is read on the morning of Shavuot, the holiday, second of the rabbinic Deraisa holidays that follows the Torah, that follows Pesach. In fact, we count 49 days, and the 50th day is Shavuos. It's the Aseret holiday. And one of the reasons Megillahs Ruth is read on that day is that it represents chesed. There's chesed, kindness, with Ruth going with her mother-in-law after Naomi, after poverty, after Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, and her two sons, Machlon, who was married to Ruth, and Kilian, who was married to Orpah, both princesses of Moab, part of the Moab royal family. And the second chesed is when Boaz sees Ruth and is willing to let her harvest in the fields. The third chesed is ultimately when Boaz agrees to redeem Ruth. And from their union comes the ultimate ancestors of David Melech, and not only David Melech, but Perez, ultimately Boaz and Ruth. Eventually it became Perez, and who ultimately resulted in David Melech. And on a deeper level, chesed also is reflected. The whole Torah is based on chesed. Chesed to one's fellow man and woman, even chesed to animals, even chesed to land. When we have the Shemitah year. Now, on one level, it's a story of the recap of the whole, it's a story of Ruth until her ultimate redemption. Now, I'd like to look at it on another level, based on the commentary of the Ramchal on Megillahs Ruth. And if one looks at the beginning of the book of Ruth, Yehi b'mei shofet shoftim v'ayu rav v'eretz v'elech ish m'beis lechem Yehuda l'gor sidei Moab hu ishto v'shnei banav. And it happened in the days when the judges judged that there was a famine in the land of, and a man went from Beit Lechem in Yehuda to sojourn in the fields of Moab. He, his wife, and two sons. Shem ish Elimelech, Shem ish to Naomi, Shem shnei banim, Machlon v'Kilian, v'Efrati m'beis Lechem Yehuda, and Vivu Sadai Moab Yehusha. And it then goes on to say, the man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and his two sons were Machlon and Kilion. The Fridays of Beit Lechem, Bethlehem, as it's called in English, in Yehuda. They came to the fields of Moab, and there they remained. The Mesa Elimelech died, Ish Naomi, the Shah Ish Nei Bamim, then Naha, her and her 2 sons, Yusu Lehem, Nashim Moabit, Shamachas Afra, and Shani's Ruth, and Shavu Shem Eseshanim. Elimelech's husbands died, and she was left with her 2 sons. He married Moabite women, one named Orpah, and the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Meso Shnehem, 2 sons died, Malcolm and Kilian, the Isha, Shnei Yoda, Isha, and a woman was bereft of 2 children and a husband. And then one daughter-in-law, Orpah, went back to Moab royal family. Ruth went with Naomi. Now, before getting into the Ramchal, it seems fairly basic here, straightforward, that it says when a judge is judged, is really saying the judges are being judged by the people. These were the leading figures of going to be each generation who had potential to become the true kings, the true leaders of Israel. According to some, even potentially have the ability to be Mashiach and to redeem the land and bring the ultimate redemption. After Elimelech died, now, and their going to Moab was, and he was extremely wealthy family. It was a famine. He could have assisted, but instead he went to what was an enemy state. And that in itself was shocking. And then when they stayed there, Elimelech died, and his 2 sons married Moabite princesses, and they both died. The Ruth is going to come with, and ultimately, as according to some, converted then, or if not, will ultimately convert and becomes one of the ancestors of King David, and by implication, obviously, eventually, Mashiach ben David. Now, according to the Ramchal, in these few opening Pesukim verses is a view on a deeper level of a lot of the history of the Jewish people encapsulated in a small number of verses. Now, if one notices the language seems to be repetitious. After we say that there was a judge who's judged, they say there was a famine in the land, and this man went to Megillahs Ruth, the fields of Moab, he, his wife, and 2 sons. Now, we then have a repetition. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, his 2 sons were Malcolm and Kilian, Ephrates of Megillahs and Yehuda, Bethlehem. He came to the field of Moab and be settled. Now, that could have all been condensed to, those sentences could have been condensed and simply said, Elimelech went from Beit Lechem, he and his wife Naomi, and his 2 sons, Malchon and Kilian. Why this repetition? Now, the Ramchal has a very interesting explanation. He's saying it's talking about two different situations. The first verse is not talking at all about Elimelech, his wife, two sons, because if he'd been talking about them, they wouldn't have had to have two verses about it. And instead, what he is saying, who were they referring to? Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, leader of the Jewish people. He had to remain in Moab. Just before he was died, Hashem not only showed him all the land, gave him special vision, but showed him the whole history of the Jewish people to the end of days. And the question, there's a number of questions, one of which is why didn't he go into with the Jewish people? That is a fascinating topic itself, which I was speaking about when we're dealing with Parshas Chukat in a number of weeks. And in any event, beyond that, he had to stay in Moab because the generation that had come out of Egypt, who had rebelled twice, once with the golden calf, and then rebelled again with the Ra, believed the spies who were slandering the land of Israel. They couldn't go in, and at the end of days, and people will be resurrected. They will only be able to be resurrected, that generation, in the merit of Moshe Rabbeinu being with him. So that is another reason he had to be in Moab. And the field he is talking about. So that is Moshe Rabbeinu. So what is being talked about in the second verse, third verse, was talking about Elimelech, Naomi, Machlon and Kilian. Now, on a deeper level, the Ramchal says those four figures, Elimelech, Naomi, Machlon and Kilian, represents something far, far bigger. And who is Elimelech? He represents the leaders, the judges, the shoftim, and the kings of the Davidic dynasty, starting with David Melech to the end of the destruction of the first temple, and explains that if these people had that Elimelech, representing that the dynasty, could have been, any one of them could have been Mashiach, it was only because of the, to a certain extent, the weakness of some of those kings, but also because the Jewish people were not worthy of it. Mashiach did not come for the ultimate redemption. And who does Naomi represent? She represents Knesset Israel, the Jewish people. Now, that is the Jewish people, not only at the time of Ruth and Naomi, but throughout our history and our travels, both through time and exiles. And so who do Machlon and Kilian represent? They represent the two Mashiachs, Mashiach ben David and Mashiach ben Ephraim. Now, to give a brief explanation, The Ramchal does not go into detail about that, but to give a brief explanation based on many sources, including the Orachaim, Kodesh, is that the Jewish people had to go through, potentially they could have, if they made different decisions, some of them could have been avoided. They went through 4 exiles after the exile in Egypt. The first one was in Babylonia at the end of the First Temple era in Persia Empire, which succeeded Babylonia, and they were able to return. Many stayed in Babylonia, many of the Jews did not come back, but a second temple was rebuilt. And during that era, we had the third exile, which was that of the Greeks. There it was unique. They were not trying to destroy us physically. They were trying to make the people of Israel abandon the Torah and to take on Greek ideas and Greek concepts. And only when they rebelled and refused after a while, there was, prior to that, massive assimilation by the Jewish population, even the Kohanim, the priests, into Greek culture, which emphasized the physical, the nature, and not higher spiritual things. And then the fourth and longest exile was that is one that is known as Asa and Rome. That's when the second temple was destroyed. This time, not because we committed some major significant sins like we did in the time of the first temple, but basically because this one was an exile where not against sins against God like the first exile period, then you have the first exile. Here it was man against man, sinus kingdom, basis hatred, which led to the collapse of the Second Jewish Commonwealth. It was destroyed by the Romans. We were exiled to various places, and basically around there's increasing persecutions by the Roman authorities, and this exile has lasted for almost 2,000 years. It's been our longest and most difficult exile. Now, to ultimately liberate us from this exile, there is going to be 2 Mashiachs. If we don't fully merit having Mashiach come, but comes at the time that Hashem is chosen instead, not because of our merits, then what is going to happen is Mashiach ben Yosef will have the gathering of the Jewish people. We're seeing that now. And it says that Mashiach ben Yosef will die over living waters. It's based on the purification of somebody who has Saras, the disease of speaking Lashon Hara. And one of the, and this, and in the purification ceremony, there are 2 birds. But one who's killed over living waters represents Mashiach ben Yosef, who will die during the gathering. Then there will be Mashiach ben David. That's after the ingathering. Nations will attack Israel. Be the battle of Gog and Magog, and they will ultimately, nations will be defeated. And then we'll have the redemption. Mashiach will come. He will disprove the philosophy and ideas of the nations. and they will all come to belief in one God. Now, so Machlan represented Mashiach ben David, and Gillian represented Mashiach, known as Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben Ephraim, Yosef's two sons, in any event. That has taken an extremely long time. We have been in exile, as I said, almost 2,000 years. We have gone through many, many traumatic exiles, pogroms, dispersions, the Shoah, and that is a very, very long time to wait. Now, the Ramchal then goes on to explain that that would not have been sufficient, even the hope of Mashiach ben Ephraim and Mashiach ben David, because of the long, very long, extremely dark exile, would not be enough to maintain the hope and the faith of the Jewish people and the ultimate redemption. Something beyond that needed to be done. Now, looking at the two nations of Moab and Ammon, where did they come from? They came from Lot. Now, when Lot lived with Abraham, and he picked up a lot of the aspects of Abraham's chesed, of his kindness, and because Lot had many undesirable qualities, Abraham separated from them. Now, at the Dorshahi, Lot then went on to live in Sodom and Gomorrah. He then was saved by Hashem's will from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. However, because the famous story goes, his wife turned back, looked back, she didn't really merit being rescued, and she turned into a pillar of salt. And so who was left was Lot and his two daughters. His two daughters figuring out the rest of civilization had been wiped out, not just Sodom and Gomorrah. They each respectively plied their father with wine, and they became pregnant by him. He was not aware of what was going on. And one of those was became the nation of Moab. The name was literally the first daughter from my father. Second one, Amnon, was the meant from my people. A little more modesty there. And because of that, these two nations, which were enemies of Israel, were allowed to arise so that two worthy descendants of Lot and his daughters could come to rejoin Israel. One of those, as the Ramchal explains, is Ruth. Now, Ruth was a descendant of Moab, and Lot had many qualities of chesed. Now, there are two types of genetics. We normally think of DNA as physical DNA, and from there you get the traits. There's a second type of DNA, which is known as spiritual DNA, in which spiritual characteristics can be passed on. So what was passed on was the chesed of Abraham through Lot, through his daughters, and to the time of Hosseini, David Melech, and that quality was going to infuse the Jewish people with the extra amount of chesed and outside spiritual qualities, plus also, not specifically said in the Ramchal, but based on other sources, that also the spiritual sparks of Kedusha that were in Moab were extracted from the population, which also strengthened the Jewish people. Now, that explains one nation, Moab, according to Paul, who's the second people. Second people who came from them was Naamah, who became one of the wives of Shlomo Melech King Solomon, and their relationship, their marriage, produced the next heir to the Davidic throne, Shlomo's son, and that infused the remainder of the chesed into the people during the long exile. And so by that, we've been able to maintain and survive and hold on to the idea of ultimate redemption through the darkest of times. Now, so Mashiach, as I explained, Mashiach ben Yosef will come, Shpiach ben David will also come. He will, as I said, will be a spiritual, intellectual war. He'll be battling with the nations. Now, according to the Ramchal, what comes from there is then Moshe Rabbeinu will come back and he will become the king of the world as the servant of Hashem during the time of the redemption, the gathering of the exiles of Jewish people, and at the time of the Kiyat Metim, the resurrection of the dead. Now, if one can comprehend just how amazing it is that the whole history of the Jewish people, we supported the Ramchal, from the time we entered Eretz Israel, is encapsulated in a very few verses. And just like we've seen the difficult part that required Ruth and Naamah to join the Jewish people, may we merit the redemption and the ending of all of travails through history, and merit the ultimate redemption coming in Mashiach, the Metim and resurrection of the dead speedily this year. Hag Sameach and Good Yantiv.